Have you ever seen a movie that you've enjoyed but was so self-contained that you don't care about the wider franchise it's attached to? Yeah, that's me with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. It's a very solid movie in its own right, but it doesn't really convince me to be interested in the MCU again. And what's nice about it is, it's not asking you to. Unlike most of the Disney Plus shows and movies like Thor 4 or Ant-Man 3, it's just a good story wrapped up nicely in a 2.5-hour package. It continues James Gunn's signature boisterousness that has a distinct focus on absurdist comedy while not undercutting the emotional beats of the story. It helps that story is also really compelling and an excellent way to wrap up the Guardians' overall story. I'm going to keep this a non-spoiler review for anyone who hasn't seen it, and while I don't necessarily think it's a must-see, if you wanted to see it, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Now, there are a couple of concessions you're going to have to make while watching this movie, not necessarily problems in and of themselves, just weird choices that you're going to have to accept, much like James Gunn's other movies. The biggest one is probably the movie's structure. It's a lot like the second movie's structure, with a few different character threads which each get variable amounts of focus. Some, like Rockets, get a lot of focus and are very compelling, but then others don't. That wouldn't be so bad in other movies, but Gunn has a bad habit of writing even the most basic subplots to be surprisingly compelling, so it makes it a little disappointing when these threads don't get as much focus. Gamora's subplot was probably the least interesting. I was a little disappointed that she didn't just die in Infinity War because I had a feeling that bringing her back was just an excuse to reset the status quo for the third Guardians movie. Thankfully though, they don't do that. However, do be warned that if you wanted to see this for Gamora, she is not the same character in any way as the versions from Guardians 2 or Infinity War. And the movie makes it very clear that that's the case. But ultimately, that subplot had a nice payoff that I didn't expect, so it wasn't bad, it was just the least interesting story thread for me. Rocket's subplot is definitely the most interesting, although it's a little weird that it uses such a played-out trope to tell its story. To keep it spoiler-free, Rocket's thread takes a flashback structure, and the in-universe reason why those flashbacks occur uses a very old trope that feels a little contrived. However, it's made up for by the fact that those sequences were some of the most compelling and simultaneously anxiety-inducing sequences in the MCU. The High Evolutionary is both hilarious and surprisingly scary, and I liked his third act breakdown where he gets increasingly manic as his plans are burnt to the ground. And overall, it's a very good subplot that introduces some very sweet characters and has a very tragic conclusion that feeds into Rocket's character arc nicely and sets up the climax quite well. It's very sweet. This is a very sweet movie overall. It's far more mushy than the previous two Guardians movies, which makes sense since this is the conclusion of the trilogy. It's far more willing to give emotional moments their dues than undercut them with jokes. That is to say, comedy still exists, and it was very funny, but it's mostly kept separate from the actual narrative, with the exception of a couple of lines that are both funny and heartwarming. This, of course, doesn't mention the directing and cinematography, which were stellar as always. The art direction was inspired, and the camera is very dynamic, leading to some very good action scenes. The spectacle in this movie is several tiers higher than most of the rest of the MCU of late. Even in Black Panther 2, I can't remember any sequences that stand out as much as some of the action scenes in this. So yeah, it's a very, very solid movie, and it might actually be my favorite of the trilogy, and that's really saying something since I really like the second Guardians movie. It's good, I like it, it doesn't get me excited for future MCU entries, but it's nice to know that James Gunn is still a good writer and a talented director. 8 out of 10.